My name is Loretta. I am 68 years old, and my occupation is a retired head nurse. I sat quietly in the sterile hospital hallway as my ungrateful children ruthlessly carved up my life savings like a Thanksgiving turkey. They were so focused on cashing in on my impending death that they forgot I was still the one in charge. Tomorrow morning they will finally discover who actually owns my entire estate. It all started on a mundane Tuesday afternoon. I had experienced a mild dizzy spell while tending to my garden. Simply a sudden drop in my blood sugar that made the world spin for a brief moment. The emergency room doctors insisted on keeping me for a few hours of observation, just to be entirely certain nothing serious was wrong. A young orderly had placed me in a wheelchair and tucked me into a quiet, shadowed alcove near the waiting area while my room was being prepared. The corridor was empty and silent, save for the low hum of the fluorescent lights above me. That was the exact moment I heard the familiar voices echoing from around the corner. It was my son Tyrone and my daughter Keisha. I felt a sudden warmth in my chest, and I was about to call out to them, deeply touched that my children had rushed to the hospital so quickly to check on me. But the warm words of greeting died instantly in my throat when I heard my white daughter-in-law Chloe and my white son-in-law Brad chime into the conversation. They were not pacing the floor in worry over my health. They were not frantically asking the nurses for updates on my condition. They were arguing aggressively, and the subject of their heated debate was my money. Brad was speaking in that arrogant, entitled tone he always used whenever he visited my home. He told Keisha they needed to move fast before I completely lost my mind or unexpectedly passed away. He firmly stated that my house alone was worth a fortune in the current real estate market, and they needed to quickly secure the deed before any potential medical bills could eat up the equity. Chloe chimed in right after him, her voice dripping with cold practicality and absolutely zero empathy. She told my son Tyrone that my life savings and my life insurance policy could easily cover their overdue mortgage payments. I sat completely frozen in my wheelchair, my hands gripping the armrests so tightly my knuckles turned white. My own flesh and blood. The children I had sacrificed my entire youth to raise and protect were standing mere feet away, dividing my hard-earned assets, while my heart was still beating strongly in my chest. Keisha then muttered that they needed to find a care facility for me immediately, specifying that it needed to be an affordable place so it would not drain their upcoming inheritance, a cheap state-run nursing home, she called it. Tyrone eagerly agreed, saying my age was making me a burden anyway, and it was the most logical next step for everyone. The initial wave of heartbreaking shock that paralyzed me began to melt away quickly, replaced by a deep, freezing fury. I had given these people everything I had to give, and they were treating me like a carcass waiting to be picked clean. My sadness evaporated into a cold, hard determination. They genuinely thought I was just a weak, senile old woman ready to be discarded into a facility. But they forgot one crucial detail. They forgot who actually holds the keys to this family empire. And I was going to make sure they learned that lesson the hardest way possible. My husband passed away from a sudden heart attack when Tyrone was just starting high school and Keisha was barely in middle school. It felt like the ground beneath my feet had completely caved in, leaving me standing over a bottomless pit of grief and fear. I was left alone in the bustling heart of Atlanta to raise a black boy and a black girl by myself, fully aware that the world outside our front door would not offer them any favors or free passes. I wiped my tears, buried my own mourning deep inside my chest, and threw myself entirely into my work. I was a registered nurse at one of the busiest, most chaotic hospitals in the city. Through sheer grit, endless prayer, and unyielding determination, I worked my way up to the position of head nurse, but earning that title did not come without a massive, heavy price. To keep a sturdy roof over our heads and to build a solid future for my children. I volunteered for every grueling night shift, every major holiday rotation, and every single overtime hour I could possibly get my hands on. I poured every ounce of my energy into their survival. I ignored my own exhaustion, pushing through migraines and sick days because calling out meant a smaller paycheck. My entire existence was reduced to the harsh, sterile fluorescent lights of the hospital ward and the brief, restless hours of exhausted sleep I managed to catch during the day. I still remember the sharp, stinging pain shooting up my legs and settling in my lower back from standing on hard tile floors for 12 to 14 hours straight. I remember my worn-out white nursing shoes literally taped together at the soles because I absolutely refused to spend $50 on myself when Keisha needed new textbooks for her advanced classes. While my children were safely asleep in their warm beds, I was eating cold, leftover dinners out of cheap plastic containers in a cramped, windowless hospital break room. I sacrificed my youth, my vibrant social life, and my own physical health to ensure they never felt the bitter sting of poverty. I wore the same threadbare, faded winter coat for over a decade, so Tyrone could wear the proper brand name clothes to fit in with his peers and hold his head high. I wanted them to have everything I did not. I desperately wanted them to walk across a university stage and grasp those degrees. And they did. Tyrone earned his business degree, and Keisha graduated in communications. Watching them in their flowing caps and gowns, I felt every aching joint and every missed meal was entirely worth it. I believed I had successfully launched them into the world, shielding them from every harsh reality with my own two bruised and calloused hands. I honestly believed my lifelong job was finally done, and that I had earned a peaceful, dignified rest. I thought I had successfully built an unbreakable family legacy of love, mutual respect, and financial stability. When Keisha brought Brad home to meet me, and when Tyrone introduced me to Chloe, I welcomed my new white in-laws with open arms and a full trusting heart. I cooked huge Sunday dinners for them. I celebrated their milestones, and I treated them exactly like they were my own flesh and blood. I just wanted to see my children happy, settled, and thriving in their marriages. When Keisha and Brad decided to get married, they demanded a lavish, picturesque wedding straight out of a bridal magazine. Brad had absolutely no money to his name, and his family did not offer to contribute a single dime to the celebration. So I stepped up without a second thought. I drained a massive portion of my hard-earned savings to pay for the grand venue, the towering imported floral arrangements, and the custom designer gown Keisha desperately wanted. A few years later, Tyrone and Chloe decided they simply had to live in an upscale, expensive neighborhood. Chloe possessed incredibly high expensive tastes and demanded a luxury lifestyle they simply could not afford on their own salaries. And my son Tyrone was far too weak and eager to please to ever tell her no. When the crushing weight of their massive mortgage payments became too much for them to handle, I secretly stepped in to save them. Every single month, I quietly transferred funds from my own retirement accounts to keep the bank off their backs and to keep a pristine roof over their heads. They posted endless pictures on social media, flaunting their luxury cars and exotic vacations, carefully hiding the fact that my life's sweat was funding their facade. I never complained. I never asked for a single penny back. I silently subsidized their extravagant lives while I continued to live on a very strict, modest budget. To everyone looking in from the outside, we were the absolute picture of the modern American dream. We were the model, successful family admired by everyone at my church and deeply respected throughout our entire Atlanta community. I took immense pride in that beautiful picture. I polished that golden frame every single day, completely blinding myself to the ugly, rotten cracks forming right in front of me. I believed Chloe when she gave me her polite, practiced smiles at our Thanksgiving dinners. I believed Brad when he offered his hollow words of gratitude after drinking my wine. I believed in the flawless mask of filial piety and love my children wore so incredibly well. I truly thought my decades of back-breaking sacrifice had bought me a secure, loving, and respected old age. I believed that beautiful lie with every ounce of my soul. Right up until the chilling reality of that hospital hallway shattered the glass house I had been living in. I stayed in that wheelchair, listening to their plotting, until the nurse finally wheeled me into my private room. The doctor, a kind man named Dr. Sterling, came in a few minutes later to discuss my low blood sugar. That is when my dear daughter-in-law Chloe and my son-in-law Brad decided to put on their grand performance. They burst into the room, their faces twisted into masks of exaggerated panic. Chloe immediately grabbed the doctor by the arm, her voice shaking with fake tears. She told him that my fainting spell was just the tip of the iceberg. She lied right to his face, claiming that I had been wandering the neighborhood at night in my nightgown, and that I was constantly forgetting my own name. Brad chimed in, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder, acting like the deeply concerned son-in-law. He told Dr. Sterling that just last week I had left the gas stove on for hours and nearly burned the entire house down. I sat there on the hospital bed, staring at them in absolute disbelief. I had not cooked on a gas stove in over 20 years since I switched to electric. But the doctor did not know that. They were deliberately painting a terrifying picture of a senile, dangerous old woman who was completely losing her grip on reality. Keisha and Tyrone stood right behind them, nodding solemnly, playing the roles of the heartbroken children who just wanted what was best for their poor, declining mother. Brad smoothly asked the doctor if he could sign a preliminary medical certificate, declaring me mentally unfit to live alone. He said it was for my own safety. He used words like cognitive decline dementia protocol and supervised care. They were actively laying the legal groundwork to strip me of my human rights, my autonomy, and my dignity. They wanted me declared legally incompetent so they could swoop in, take full control of my estate, and toss me away like a broken piece of furniture. I wanted to scream. I wanted to leap out of that hospital bed and slap the absolute fire out of both of them. But my decades of nursing experience kicked in. I knew that if I reacted with anger, if I raised my voice or defended myself too aggressively, I would only prove their point. The doctor would see a combative, confused old woman. So I took a deep breath, forced my muscles to relax, and played along. I lowered my gaze, let my shoulders slump, and put on the blank, tired face of a fragile elder. I let them believe they were winning. I nodded meekly when the doctor asked me questions, feigning exhaustion. I whispered that I was just so tired and confused. Chloe smirked, a tiny, triumphant curl of her lips that only I could see. They were utterly convinced their wicked little hospital act was flawless. They truly thought they had outsmarted a woman who had spent 40 years managing chaotic emergency rooms. I knew exactly what they were doing, and I was already 10 steps ahead of them. When I was finally discharged and brought back to my quiet home in Atlanta, I did not make a single sound of protest. I continued my performance, leaning heavily on Tyrone as he walked me to the front door. I let my hand tremble as I unlocked the deadbolt, pretending that my strength was entirely depleted. Keisha patted my back with false sympathy, telling me to rest, while she and the others went to their respective homes. As soon as their luxury cars pulled out of my driveway, my trembling stopped. My posture straightened, and the weak, frail old woman vanished, replaced by the fierce head nurse they had foolishly underestimated. I knew my children and their spouses were hiding something huge. People do not scheme to lock away a perfectly healthy mother unless desperation is driving them. I walked straight into Tyrone and Chloe's old bedroom, which they still used to store their overflow boxes and mail when they visited. I systematically went through the stack of papers Chloe had carelessly tossed on the desk. It did not take me long to find the glaring truth. Chloe had maxed out 4 different premium credit cards. The statements showed massive, suffocating balances stemming from designer handbags, lavish spa days, and high-end restaurant tabs. She was drowning in retail debt, paying exorbitant interest rates, while pretending to be a wealthy, successful socialite. But the real shock came when I dug into a discarded leather briefcase Brad had left behind in the guest room during his last stay. Inside the inner pocket, I found collection notices and legal threats from aggressive private lenders. Brad was not the brilliant investment banker he claimed to be. The documents revealed a massive, crippling gambling addiction and owed thousands of dollars to people you do not want to owe money to. His arrogant swagger was nothing but a fragile shield to hide his absolute financial ruin. My son and my daughter were married to bottomless pits of debt. Their picture-perfect American dream was a hollow, rotting illusion built on lies and unpaid bills. They were entirely broke. That was the sickening, undeniable truth. They did not want to put me in a home because of my health. They needed to declare me legally incompetent so they could liquidate my home and drain my life savings to save themselves from bankruptcy. They were planning to steal the money I had literally broken my back to earn just to cover Chloe's shopping addiction and Brad's reckless gambling. The realization washed over me like a bucket of ice water. But it did not break me. It only sharpened my focus. I carefully placed every document back exactly where I found it. I was not going to expose them yet. I was going to let them dig their own graves deep and wide before I buried them in their own deceit. 2 days later, my children staged their next calculated move. Tyrone and Keisha came over for what they called a serious family discussion. They sat me down at my own dining room table, the very same oak table where I had fed them, tutored them, and loved them for decades. Tyrone pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his briefcase and slid them gently toward me. He spoke in that low, soothing voice people used to talk to frightened children. He told me that my health was rapidly declining and that it was time to make the responsible choice for my future. Keisha leaned forward, placing her perfectly manicured hand over mine. She painted a gorgeous, elaborate picture of an upscale retirement community just outside the city limits. She described lush green gardens, round-the-clock gourmet meals, and a vibrant community of seniors where I would be treated like absolute royalty. She promised me it was a 5-star resort, masquerading as a care facility. But I had already done my own research the night before. I knew exactly which facility they were talking about. It was a notoriously underfunded, bleak, state-run nursing home with a terrible reputation for neglecting its residents. It was the cheapest place they could legally dump me while ensuring maximum profit from the sale of my house. Tyrone tapped the top of the documents, explaining that all I needed to do was sign the power of attorney papers. He swore it was just a formality, a simple legal tool that would allow him and Keisha to handle the stressful paperwork of selling my house and paying for my new, luxurious care facility. They sat there, smiling at me, their faces completely devoid of guilt. They were asking me to sign away my freedom, my finances, and my entire livelihood so they could pay off their spouses' reckless debts. In the past, this kind of profound betrayal from my own flesh and blood would have shattered my heart into a million irreparable pieces. I would have wept until my eyes swelled shut. But looking at them now, sitting across from me with their predatory smiles, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating emptiness. The last tear I would ever shed for my ungrateful children had already fallen. I did not cry. I did not yell. I simply picked up the pen they offered me. I let my hand shake violently as I held it, putting on the performance of a lifetime. I told them I needed a little bit of time to read through the documents because my eyes were so tired and my mind felt so incredibly foggy. Tyrone happily agreed, leaving the papers on my table, utterly convinced they had won. They left my house victorious. unaware that they had just awakened a ruthless, determined mother who was about to teach them a brutal, unforgettable lesson in respect. The very next morning, while Tyrone and Keisha assumed I was safely deteriorating in my armchair, I called a cab and headed straight downtown to see my longtime attorney, Mr. Sterling. He had known my late husband and me for decades, handling our affairs with absolute discretion. He greeted me with a warm, familiar smile, but that smile vanished the moment I explained the vicious conversation I had overheard at the hospital. I laid everything out on his polished mahogany desk. The fake concern, the crushing debts I had discovered in their homes, the cheap nursing home brochures, and the power of attorney paperwork. They were actively trying to force down my throat. Mr. Sterling looked at me with deep, genuine sympathy, but I immediately raised my hand to stop him. I told him I did not need his pity. I needed his sharpest legal expertise to execute a flawless, devastating counterstrike against my own flesh and blood. You see, my children were undeniably greedy, but they were also incredibly short-sighted. They assumed my wealth was strictly limited to a basic savings account, a modest life insurance policy, and the brick home I lived in. They had absolutely no idea about the quiet, aggressive investments I had been making for the past 30 years. With Mr. Sterling's meticulous guidance over the decades, I had invested heavily in mutual funds, commercial real estate, and lucrative municipal bonds. My actual net worth was not a few $100,000. It was well over $4 million. But the sweetest, most devastating piece of leverage I held was something they had completely forgotten in their arrogant scramble for cash. The beautiful sprawling homes that Tyrone and Keisha currently lived in, the ones Chloe and Brad so proudly flaunted to their friends and neighbors, were still legally mine. Years ago, when they were struggling to get approved for those massive mortgages, I quietly stepped in to save them. I paid the hefty down payments entirely in cash, and I co-signed the loans, but I made absolutely sure that my name remained on both deeds as the primary owner. They were essentially my tenants, living in my properties, sleeping under roofs that I completely and legally controlled. I instructed Mr. Sterling to pull the original deeds and immediately initiate the paperwork. They wanted to strip me of my autonomy and throw me into a state-run facility so they could liquidate my assets. I was going to legally yank the very ground right out from under their feet. Mr. Sterling leaned back in his heavy leather chair, a slow, appreciative smile spreading across his face. He told me that in all his years of practicing law, he had never seen a mother so perfectly equipped to legally destroy her abusers. We spent the next 3 hours mapping out every single detail of my counterattack. I wanted no loopholes, no grey areas, and absolutely no mercy. Over the next 2 weeks, I gave my children the exact performance they were so desperately eager to see. I leaned fully into the role of the confused, compliant, and rapidly declining elderly mother. Whenever Keisha came over to check on my progress, I would intentionally misplace my keys or ask the same basic question 3 times in a row just to watch her roll her eyes. I let my hands shake visibly whenever I poured a cup of tea, deliberately spilling a few drops on the counter to sell the illusion. I even allowed Tyrone and his insufferable wife, Chloe, to hand me stacks of random, meaningless draft papers, pretending I thought they were routine medical forms. I signed them with a weak, wobbly signature, just to keep them distracted and utterly convinced of their impending victory. They practically salivated watching me scribble my name on those useless documents, assuming they were inching closer to the ultimate prize. But while they were busy celebrating their imaginary triumph in my living room, I was working tirelessly behind the scenes with a razor-sharp focus. Mr. Sterling and I were dismantling my original estate plan piece by piece. First, I completely eradicated Tyrone and Keisha from my will. I removed them as beneficiaries from my life insurance policies, my retirement funds, and every single bank account holding my name. I ensured that neither they nor their spouses would receive a solitary dime of the money I had sacrificed my entire youth to earn. Instead, I channeled my massive multi-million-dollar fortune, including the substantial equity from the homes my children were currently living in, into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. I named the trust after myself and designated its sole unbreakable purpose. Every penny of my life's work would go toward fully funding nursing school scholarships for brilliant, hardworking young black women in the Atlanta area. I wanted my money to uplift girls who had the exact same fire and determination I had when I was working those grueling night shifts. Girls who actually deserved a helping hand, rather than the entitled, ungrateful children who wanted to discard me like trash. I sat in Mr. Sterling's quiet office and signed the final legally binding documents with a perfectly steady hand. There was no hesitation, no sorrow, and certainly no confusion. With a few swift, decisive strokes of my pen, I erased my children's financial futures and secured a legacy that would change dozens of lives for the better. I felt an incredible, soaring sense of freedom as Mr. Sterling officially stamped the documents, making everything permanent. I was no longer a victim waiting to be preyed upon. I was the architect of my own justice, and the stage was finally set. With my assets completely secured and my untouchable trust legally activated, it was time to orchestrate the grand finale. I waited until a crisp Thursday morning, poured myself a hot cup of black coffee, and dialed my son's phone number. I made sure to let my voice tremble just a little bit, injecting a heavy tone of weary surrender into my words. When Tyrone answered, I told him that I had spent the last few sleepless nights doing a lot of deep, painful thinking. I softly confessed that the house was indeed getting far too large for me to manage alone, and that my memory was slipping much more than I wanted to admit. I told him he and Keisha were absolutely right. I was completely exhausted and ready to step down and let them take the reins. I could practically hear Tyrone grinning widely through the phone receiver. He tried to mask his profound excitement with a tone of fake, soothing sympathy, telling me I was making a brave and responsible choice for the family. I then asked him to gather Keisha, Chloe, and Brad and to bring their own lawyer to my house the very next morning at 10 sharp. I explicitly stated that I wanted to officially sign over the house, the power of attorney, and the entirety of my estate directly to them, so I could peacefully transition into the care facility they had chosen. Tyrone practically tripped over his own words as he eagerly agreed, assuring me they would all be there right on time with the paperwork drawn up and ready to go. I hung up the phone and permitted myself a long, satisfied smile. It was incredibly easy to manipulate people who were utterly blinded by their own relentless greed. Within an hour, Keisha called me, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, thanking me for being so understanding and promising that this was the absolute best thing for everyone. She even offered to bring a celebratory brunch to mark the occasion. They were already spending my money in their minds, thoroughly convinced they had finally outsmarted the frail old woman. They had no idea they were enthusiastically marching straight into a carefully laid, inescapable trap. They were celebrating a massive inheritance that had legally ceased to exist days ago. I spent that evening quietly tidying up my living room, dusting the family portraits, and meticulously arranging the seating for my guests. I wanted my home to look perfectly immaculate, for the devastating truth that was about to be unleashed within its walls. They thought tomorrow morning would be the crowning moment of their malicious scheme. They had absolutely no clue that tomorrow morning the curtain would abruptly fall, and they would discover just how ruthlessly a mother can fight back when pushed entirely to the edge. Friday morning arrived exactly as scheduled. Promptly at 10 o'clock, the doorbell chimed through my quiet house. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing out the fabric of my favorite linen dress, and remained seated in my plush armchair with a warm cup of chamomile tea resting in my hands. Tyrone unlocked the front door using his spare key and led the parade into my living room. Keisha followed closely behind him, clutching her designer purse, while my white daughter-in-law Chloe and my white son-in-law Brad marched in looking like they had just won the lottery. They did not come alone. They brought a slick-looking lawyer with them. A man in a cheap suit carrying a clipboard, hired specifically to make sure I signed away my entire life without any legal hiccups. Chloe immediately began scanning my living room, her eyes darting across my antique vases and solid wood furniture, as if she was already pricing items for an estate sale. Brad stood near the doorway, impatiently tapping his foot and checking his watch, clearly eager to get his hands on the cash that would save him from his gambling debts. Tyrone approached me with a fake, pitiful smile. He spoke slowly and loudly, treating me like a toddler who could not comprehend basic English. He placed the thick stack of power of attorney documents on my coffee table and handed me a pen, telling me that his lawyer was here to witness the signature, so I could finally go to the nice retirement home and rest. Keisha chimed in, falsely cooing about how much they loved me and how this was the absolute best choice for my declining health. I did not take the pen. I took a slow sip of my tea, savoring the warmth, and looked at each of their greedy faces. I told Tyrone that I would not be signing anything today. The fake smiles vanished instantly. Brad groaned in frustration, and the slick lawyer stepped forward, warning me that my mental state left me no choice but to comply. That was the exact moment the heavy oak door of my hallway creaked open. Mr. Sterling stepped out into the living room looking incredibly sharp in his tailored suit, carrying a massive leather briefcase filled to the brim with my counterattack. The colour drained completely from Tyrone and Keisha's faces. Chloe gasped, stepping back as Mr. Sterling stood firmly by my side. Mr. Sterling placed his heavy briefcase on the coffee table right on top of their useless paperwork. I set my teacup down and stood up. I did not shake. I did not stagger. I stood tall, channeling every ounce of the fierce head nurse who used to command entire hospital floors. I looked my ungrateful children dead in the eye and delivered the first crushing blow. I told them their power of attorney documents were absolute garbage. Mr. Sterling smoothly pulled out 3 separate legally binding certificates of mental competency from 3 independent, highly respected psychiatrists in Atlanta. They all confirmed that my mind was as sharp as a diamond and that I possessed full, unquestionable capacity to manage my own affairs. The slick lawyer they brought immediately backed away, realizing he had walked into a massive legal trap. Keisha started to stutter, but I raised my hand and silenced her instantly. Then I delivered the second blow. I turned to Chloe and Brad, watching their arrogant faces turn a sickly shade of pale. I reminded them that the beautiful, sprawling homes they lived in, the ones I had paid the down payments for and co-signed the mortgages on, were legally registered with me as the primary owner. Mr. Sterling handed Tyrone and Keisha crisp formal envelopes. I informed them that those envelopes contained official 30-day eviction notices. I was legally withdrawing all financial support, and since they could not afford the massive monthly payments without my secret transfers, they had exactly 1 month to pack their bags and vacate my properties or face immediate legal removal. Chloe let out a horrified shriek, her hands flying to her mouth. Brad stumbled backward, knowing his gambling creditors were going to destroy him without my money. Tyrone tried to speak, begging me to be reasonable. But the final, most devastating truth was yet to come. I looked at the children I had sacrificed my youth for and told them the ultimate consequence of their greed. I revealed that I had completely rewritten my will and stripped them of their inheritance. I explained that my entire multi-million-dollar estate, including the properties they were about to be kicked out of, had been irreversibly transferred into a charitable trust. Every single penny of my wealth was going to fund nursing school scholarships for hard-working young black women. They were officially getting absolutely nothing. They were entirely cut off, and they would now have to face their suffocating debts all by themselves. The living room erupted into absolute chaos. Chloe fell onto the sofa, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her shopping debts and impending homelessness crushed her. Brad began screaming in pure despair, cursing at the walls, knowing his gambling lenders would show him no mercy. Tyrone and Keisha both collapsed to their knees right there on my living room rug. Keisha grabbed the hem of my dress, weeping bitterly, begging me to forgive them, and claiming it was all a terrible misunderstanding. Tyrone pleaded with me, swearing that they loved me and desperately asking for a second chance. I looked down at them without a single shred of sympathy. I calmly pulled my dress from Keisha's grasp, told them to get out of my house, and instructed Mr. Sterling to call the police if they refused to leave immediately. I coldly turned my back on their wailing and walked away, shutting the heavy oak door behind me without looking back once. Within an hour, my bags were packed and a taxi was waiting in my driveway. I left them drowning in the ruins of their own making, headed straight to the airport. I flew to a luxury beachfront condo in Florida, finally ready to breathe the ocean air and begin a beautiful, peaceful new life entirely for myself. I sit here now on the balcony of my new home, feeling the warm Florida sun on my skin and listening to the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves. The sea breeze carries away the last remnants of the heavy burden I carried for so many decades. Looking out at this endless horizon, I feel a profound sense of peace that I have not known since my husband passed away. I want to share a truth with you, a truth that cost me years of sweat and tears to fully understand. Never ever confuse a mother's love for weakness. We mothers have the capacity to give our absolute everything. We can break our own backs, wear our shoes down to the soles and starve ourselves just to see our children thrive. But they must never forget that the same hands that built them up can also tear down the safety nets we created if that fundamental respect disappears. We can give it all, but we have the absolute right and the power to take it all back when loyalty is replaced by greed. True wealth is not found in the luxury cars you drive or the expensive zip codes you live in. Money does not define a family. It never has, and it never will. What binds us together? What truly makes us a family is unwavering loyalty, mutual respect, and genuine gratitude. If those things are missing, then all the money in the world cannot fix the rotting foundation of your home. So now I am turning the question over to you, my beautiful sisters. I know there are so many of you out there who have poured your entire souls into raising your children, only to be met with cold entitlement when you reached your golden years. If you found yourself in my exact position, sitting in that wheelchair, and hearing your own flesh and blood plotting your downfall, what would you do? Would you have stayed silent to keep the peace? Or would you have fought back with everything you had, just like I did? Please go down into the comments and tell me your thoughts, because I truly want to read every single one of your perspectives. We draw so much strength from sharing our truth with one another. If my journey resonated with your spirit today, please hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to the channel so you can hear more powerful, real-life stories just like this one. Before you go, drop a comment, letting me know what beautiful city you are watching this video from right now, and tell me what time it is over there. I love seeing how far these stories travel and connecting with my sisters all across the country. Stay strong, protect your peace, and never let anyone steal your hard-earned dignity. God bless you all abundantly, and I will see you in the next story.